Stephen D. Richards, known by the nicknames the Nebraska Fiend and the Ohio Monster, was an American serial killer who confessed to committing 9 to 11 murders in Nebraska and Iowa between 1876 and 1878. When he later confessed to his crimes, he claimed to have committed the first murder sometime in late 1876, 2 weeks after arriving in Kearney, Nebraska. He went on to commit several other murders, which he later claimed were done in self-defense. He was regarded as handsome and charismatic by some contemporary chroniclers, who described his appearance and behaviour as completely obscuring his nature as a cold-blooded killer. In modern times, he is known as Nebraska's first documented serial killer in Nebraska, and the first person to be executed by the state. In the mid-19th century, Nebraska experienced a period of territorial expansion in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which saw the creation of Nebraska and Kansas territories to facilitate the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1867, Nebraska was admitted into the Union as the 37th state, 2 years after the conclusion of the American Civil War. Nebraska's newfound statehood led to an influx of settlers among the growing population and political controversies incited by the state's first governor, David Butler. Renewed calls for a state constitution were made in 1871. During Richard's crime spree and trial, Nebraska's law and justice system had only recently been developed, with the state's criminal code written into the state law by 1871. Before his execution, the state had only one recorded execution, in 1863, 4 years before its inclusion into the US. Stephen Decatur Richards was born in Wheeling, Virginia on the 18th of March, 1856. He was said to have 5 sisters and 1 brother. When he was 6, his family relocated to Ohio, first to Monroe County and then to Noble County. The family then later settled in the Quaker village of Mount Pleasant in Ohio when he was 11. He described his mother as a devout Methodist and his father, a farmer, as having made no profession of religion. Richard attended a school in Mount Pleasant. He claimed that the teachers considered him well behaved. At his mother's insistence, he also attended Sunday school and church regularly. Up until the age of 20, he lived with his parents, working farmers and other locals in the area. On the 16th of September 1871, his mother died of an unknown cause. At the age of 20, he met and became engaged to a young woman named Anna Milhorn, with whom he corresponded during his later travels. He also met men whom he described as being of questionable occupation. He began passing counterfeit bills he obtained from a man in New York City. In February 1876, he left Mount Pleasant, heading west for better career opportunities. For a short time, he lived in Iowa and worked as a farmhand in Burlington and Morning Sun. He was later hired as an attendant at the Iowa Lunatic Asylum, now the Mount Pleasant Mental Health Institute, in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, tasked with burying deceased patients. The New York Times wrote Richard's time working at the asylum was a significant event in his life that shaped his own humanity and his view of the human race. While he denied witnessing any abuse of the asylum's patients, he later reflected that during his tenure of handling and disposing of deceased patients, he became accustomed to viewing people as nothing more than meat. He left the asylum in October 1876 and began drifting around the Midwestern US, finding intermittent work and occasionally consorting with train robbers. He stayed in Kansas City briefly before moving to Nebraska, where he passed through Hastings before arriving in Kearney, residing there for 2 to 3 weeks before leaving for Cheyenne County. According to Richards, he became involved in several gunfights during his stay. That resulted in him shooting each individual, although he stated that he was unaware of their condition after each confrontation. During this period, Richards went under the name of William Hudson and later discarded this once he reached Kansas City. In a confession written after his final arrest, he admitted to having killed 4 men during his travels around Nebraska and Iowa between 1876 and 1877. He described committing his first murder sometime in late 1876, 2 weeks after arriving in Kearney. Contemporary newspaper reports of the site of Richard's first murder varied, some saying it was near Dobbytown and others giving it as near Sand Hills. According to Richards, he met a man while travelling on horseback through the Nebraska countryside, and the pair decided to camp for the night near Dobbytown. Several newspapers reported that the 2 men's campsite were instead near Sand Hills. Settling down for the night, the 2 began gambling in a game of cards, with Richard winning most of the strangers' money. As the 2 set off for Kearney the following morning, the other man turned on Richard and demanded his money back. Richard refused, whereupon he claimed the other man became belligerent. Richard then shot him above the left eye, killing him instantly. After confirming the man was dead, he disposed of the body in the Platte River. Several days later, he continued his trek to Kearney. Richard encountered another man 50 miles from the area called Walker's Ranch. The man had seen Richard with the previous traveller together, and the stranger asked what had become of the man. While talking to him, Richard realised that this man and the deceased were friends and business partners. Richard denied any knowledge of the dead man, but the friend continued to hound Richards with questions, which caused Richards to become increasingly anxious. Believing the man knew too much, Richards decided to kill the stranger to prevent any discovery of the murder. When the stranger turned his back to Richards, he shot him in the back of the head. He disposed of the corpse and then sold the man's horse in a nearby town. Before reaching Kearney, he then stopped at the home of Jasper Halston, who, according to Richards, was a train robber. Mary, Jasper's wife, noticed upon his arrival that Richard's shirt was stained with blood and commented on it. Richards had not noticed the blood on his clothes and claimed to have replied, as if in jest, that it must have come from the men he had murdered. That ended the conversation. After a stay, Richard travelled to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he used counterfeit money to purchase a horse and a buggy from an unidentified man. After he left, the seller discovered the bills were not genuine. Tracking Richards down, the seller demanded that Richards give him real money or return the horse and buggy. With Richard refusing both demands, the man threatened to have him arrested, and Richard responded by shooting him. He then buried the body and left the area. In March 1877, Richards and a young man with the surname Gemge left Grand Island, Nebraska on horseback and headed towards Kearney. As they neared their destination, they stopped and camped for the night between Lowell and Kearney along the Platte River. Richards woke up at about 3 a.m. and rused his partner, telling him that it was nearly morning and that they should get back to work. Gemge, infuriated at being awakened so early, began arguing with Richards. The argument continued. Richard later recounted. After leaving the area, Richard arrived at Kearney, registering under the name F.A. Hodge at a local hotel. During his stay, Richards reunited with several old acquaintances, George Dutch Henry Johnson and his companion Hurst, as well as a man who went by the name Mr. Burns. On the 21st of March, Richards was arrested along with Burns, whom he had been spending most of his time with. At the time, both men were not told as to the reason of their arrest, although Richards came to suspect that it was for the murder of Gemge. It was only later that they were notified by the authorities that they were under suspicion of the murder of a man named Peter Geetway, whom Richard claimed his innocence over. Although Richard was soon acquitted, Burns was held in custody because of a testimony of a sporting lady whom he had previously been acquainted with. Burns would also be acquitted sometime later after no evidence was found linking him to the crime. Newspaper coverage of the Halson family, spelled as Harrelson in this account, and Anderson murders. In June 1878, while in Kearney, he was arrested and jailed for larceny. He later claimed that his charge was unfounded. During his time in jail, he reunited with Mary L. Halson. Shortly before Richard's arrival, she had been arrested under suspicion of having aided the escape of her husband and another prisoner named Underwood or Nixon from the Kearney jail. Richards and Mary Halson agreed that she would sell him the deed to her property 6 months later for $600, $17,000 in 2023. After Richards was released from jail, he travelled around Nebraska for several months. He did business in Hastings, Bloomington, and Grand Island before arriving at the Halsons' Kearney County homestead on the 18th of October, 1878. Mary Halson transferred the property to Richards upon his arrival. The New York Daily Herald later reported that Richards had married Halson on the 2nd of November in what the newspaper alleged was a scam to acquire ownership of Halson's land. A month later, Richard decided to kill Halson and her 3 children, 10-year-old Daisy, 4-year-old Mabel, and 2-year-old Jasper, nicknamed Jesse. In his confession, Richard claimed that Halson had discovered that he was guilty of murder, and he feared that she might betray his presence to the authorities. To silence Halson and ensure that his previous crimes remained hidden, Richard resolved to murder the entire family. On the 3rd of November 1878, Richards got up early in the morning along with another man named Brown, who had been staying at the house. Brown left to feed the horses and complete other chores around the farm. Richards found a spade and dug a hole, then sneaked back into the house and murdered Mary, Daisy, Mabel, and Jessie with an axe. According to one report, Mary and one of the children were murdered with a smoothing iron while the other 2 were physically assaulted. This claim was also reported by some modern-day sources who graphically described Richards killing Jasper by bashing his head against the wall. However, these alternate details of the murder were refuted by Richards himself, saying that he'd killed the family while they were asleep. He said that most of them had died after the several blows, with the exception of Daisy, who had writhed in pain for some time by Richards' own account. He was said to have scrubbed the blood off the floor and himself after the murders before calmly sitting down for breakfast. After he had eaten, he carried the bodies out of the house and buried them in the hole he had dug nearby. When he was later questioned about the Halsons' disappearance, he told several people that the family had left with Brown and that he didn't know when they would return. A 21st century account stated Richards had made claims of Halson transferring the deeds of the farm to him and subsequently left with her children to reunite with her husband. The bodies of Halson and her children were discovered on the 11th of December. Some reports said that they had been concealed underneath a haystack rather than buried, as Richards had later claimed. On the 9th of December 1878, Richards agreed to help his neighbour, a 26-year-old immigrant from Sweden named Peter Anderson, with some work on Anderson's property. The Columbus Journal reported that Richard had used the alias Dick Richardson when working for Anderson. On the 9th of December, Anderson became ill after eating a meal Richards had prepared, causing him to suspect that Richards had poisoned him. Anderson informed a neighbour of his suspicions. The next day, he confronted Richards. The two fought, and Richards either beat Anderson to death with a hammer or hatchet, or shot him. Contemporary newspaper accounts vary. Anderson's body was later discovered in the cellar of his house, buried underneath a pile of coal. Richards strongly denied poisoning Anderson, saying that it was not his style. He claimed Anderson had attacked him with a knife and that he'd killed Anderson in self-defense. Anderson was later buried at the Bethany Cemetery in Axel, Nebraska. Richards fled Kearney shortly after Anderson's murder, expecting the bodies would soon be discovered. In the evening, he was hitching up Anderson's horses and preparing to leave. Some of Anderson's neighbours arrived. They had noticed Anderson's absence and questioned him about it. He reportedly told them that Anderson was inside the house. As Anderson's neighbours entered the dwelling, Richards fled on horseback, riding to Bloomington. He travelled east by horse and train and on foot, passing through Omaha and Chicago. While on the run, he met up with Jasper Halson and Halson's fellow escaped prisoner. The three travelled through Wheeling, West Virginia, and into Ohio, passing through Bridgeport, before arriving in Richards' hometown of Mount Pleasant. Nebraska Governor Silas Garber issued an arrest warrant for Richards on the 16th of December 1876 and promised a reward of $200, $6,000 in 2023, for his arrest and conviction. Most accounts state that on the 20th of December, after Richards arrived in Mount Pleasant, he attended a ballroom dance accompanied by two unidentified women. Copies of a wanted poster featuring Richards had been circulated throughout the town recently, and a constable named McGrew recognised him from the poster. He enlisted the help of a penitentiary guard named Folg, and the two men armed themselves with shotguns and set off after Richards. They found him walking through a field just outside the town with two women. He was unarmed and quickly surrendered. Richard claimed that he'd spotted the two officers approaching him, intending to fight his way out of the situation. He told the women to head back to town. They refused, however, so Richard chose to surrender. He said that if the woman had left, he would have avoided arrest. Richard said that if he had escaped, he would have gone to Nebraska, as he reasoned that it was the last place anyone would look for him. Some accounts differed about the date and place of Richard's arrest. The Wheeling Daily Intelliger said that upon arriving in a town near Mount Pleasant, he was identified by a former acquaintance who detained him with the help of another person. One source claims that Richard was arrested in early 1879 in Austin, Texas. One modern-day account reported that Richards, whom they listed under the name Samuel Richards, had been identified and captured by Pinkerton agents. There were even conflicting descriptions of Richards' appearance. Newspapers described him as being approximately 6'2" and heavy built with dark hair and blue eyes. However, the account of Dr. Morland, who performed a phrenological examination of Richards before his execution, conflicted with these descriptions of him. In his examination report, Morland said Richards had light brown hair and dark grey eyes. At his execution, one spectator later described Richards as having steel grey eyes that were almost bluish in colour with dark brown hair. The Working Man's Friend, Leavenworth, Kansas newspaper reported that Chicago authorities received part of the reward. After his arrest, Richards was jailed in Steubenville, Ohio. While he was there, he wrote 2 articles for the local newspaper confessing to 9 murders in 3 years. Sheriff David Anderson of Buffalo County, Nebraska, and Sheriff Marin of Kearney County, both of whom had pursued Richards to Ohio, returned into Nebraska. Due to local public outrage, Anderson and Martin feared that Richards would be lynched if he were returned to any of the localities where he'd committed his crimes, so it was decided to avoid taking him to these places initially. At the time of Richards' arrest, the authorities suspected he was a member of a gang of outlaws who had plagued the state, or was even the group's leader. Law enforcement was able to definitively link Richards to 9 murders, to which he had confessed, and suggested that he might have killed even more, something the Nebraska State Journal expressed doubt on. Shortly before his trial, Richards predicted that he would be convicted and hanged for his crimes. He was moved to jail in Omaha on the 28th of December, then transferred to Kearney by train. On the 30th of December, a large crowd enraged townsfolk gathered outside the jail in Kearney where Richards was being kept. Fearing a lynching, authorities took extra precautions to ensure Richards' safety as well as their own. Whilst being moved to the depot, Richards was said to have been impressed by the large crowd, asking whether the whole town was here to see him. Eventually, the crowd dispersed, and there was no further incidents during the rest of his stay in Kearney. Richards' trial began on the 16th of January 1879 in Minden, Nebraska, with Judge William Gaslin presiding. The prosecution was led by a district attorney named Schofield, and Richards' defense was led by a lawyer named Savage. Schofield laid out the two indictments for murder in the first degree for the killings of the Halston family and not Anderson. Richards pleaded not guilty, arguing that Anderson's killing was in self-defense and therefore justifiable. The prosecution called 7 witnesses to the stand. They all testified to the state in which Anderson was found. Richards then was called to testify. When questioned by Schofield, he admitted to killing Anderson with a hammer after a heated argument, but reiterated that he had done so in self-defense. Richards said, although repeatedly warned not to do so, Anderson had reached for a nearby hatchet. The prosecution then entered into evidence the hammer that had been used to kill Anderson. Richards identified it as the murder weapon. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Richards guilty for the murder of the Halsons and Anderson. He was sentenced to death by hanging, and his execution date was set for the 26th of April, 1879. Richards was described as being cheerful and indifferent to both the proceedings and his conviction. The Sedalia Weekly Bazoo reported that, shortly after his conviction, Richards managed to smuggle a knife into his cell to use it for killing himself, but the weapon was discovered by authorities and confiscated before he could use it. However, no other newspaper records corroborate this story. When Richards was returned to Nebraska, the Omaha Herald wrote that he, after his conviction, Sheriff Marin announced that his execution in Minden would be open to the public, even though Marin feared the attendance of a large number of spectators could become violent. To prevent a riot, an enclosure was constructed around the gallows to separate the expected crowd from Richards. However, tickets that allowed admittance into the restricted area were sold. Richards was allowed to invite people he chose, members of the press, whom he had befriended while in prison. One such ticket of attendance was recently discovered and is now in the collection of the Nebraska Historical Society. Spectators at the execution were said to have been numbered between 2,000 and 25,000. As the crowd became increasingly agitated, the authorities pleaded with them to stay outside the enclosure, but guards were unable to prevent the spectators from destroying the barrier. One witness in the incident, a man named Rolf Johnson, later wrote that 20 to 30 people in the crowd cut the rope as authorities tried to stop the crowd. The mob proceeded to pull the post out of the ground, attempting to drag the makeshift barrier away whilst the guards were pulling the rope at the other end in what Johnson described as a tug-of-war. The mob succeeded in pulling the rope away from the guards and then proceeded to destroy the barrier completely. At 1 p.m, Richards was led to the gallows by Marin and his deputy. This pacified the crowd. Upon descending the gallows, Richards launched into an impassionate defence of his actions. He claimed that the killing of Anderson was in self-defence and disavowed any involvement in the murders of the Halston family. He claimed that he was a victim of wrongful conviction. He then said that he had found the Lord, made his peace with God, and had faith in Christ, and asked the crowd to join in singing the hymn, "Come thou font of every blessing." Every such spectator documenting the events of the execution in his journal observed that Richards appeared calm and collected during the entire ordeal. Richard's final words were said to have been, "Jesus be with me now." Reverend W. Sanford G., who presided over the execution, later told reporters that he hoped Richard's professions of religious salvation were genuine, but allowed that they might not have been. At 1:17 p.m. on the 26th of April, 1879, Richards was hanged. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat said that it took 15 minutes for him to die. Richards was the first person in Nebraska's history to be executed since its incorporation into the US in 1867. Shortly after his execution, a photographer was able to capture a photograph of Richards' corpse propped inside a coffin. This image is available to view on Google. Local doctors hounded Richards before his execution, requesting him to donate his body for medical purposes. He refused and was buried in Minden. Despite his gravesite being guarded, his corpse was stolen the night after his execution. The Sedalia Weekly Bazoo suspected that the doctors who had wanted to examine him, but he was returned to his resting place shortly thereafter. Sometime later, his body was dug up once again. This time, Richards's bones were scattered on the streets of Kearney. On the 1st of November 1882, it was reported that the Kearney County Gazette had obtained Richards's skull and placed it on display in the newspaper's office window. This was the last reported mention of Richards's skull. Its present location and status is unknown. After his arrest, many people described him as charismatic, commenting that he successfully concealed his dark nature under a polite, articulate, and handsome exterior. A friend who accompanied his autobiographer to his interview said during one visit, he didn't have the look of a murderer. Contemporary observers remarked that he seemed to feel no guilt whatsoever about his crimes. Numerous times between his arrest and execution, he was asked why he had no empathy towards his victims or remorse for his crimes. Sometimes he simply refused to answer. When he did choose to reply to this question, he gave conflicting responses. He usually cited his associations with the people of questionable morals at his time working at the Mount Pleasant Asylum as deleterious influences. When the Nebraska State Journal questioned him about his lack of remorse for the heinous murders he had committed, particularly those of the Harrison family, he recounted an event from his childhood. He had been tasked to kill a little litter of kittens and did so by bashing their heads against a tree. After he had killed all the kittens, he found that he had no guilt about it and found the killing fun. Although some outlets, including the modern-day author Michael Newton, classified Richards as a thrill killer, in interviews with the press, Richards adamantly denied that he enjoyed inflicting pain upon others, claiming that in his younger years, other people had considered him to be kind. Reporters who interviewed him after his arrest were often struck by his calm and collected behaviour. An article in the New York Daily Herald described him as being carefree and cheerful. In an interview with the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, Richards said that he knew he would be executed for his crimes, but that he was unafraid of death and was ready to meet it. When the jury sentenced him to death, he was said to have been unconcerned and in good spirits. The St. Louis Globe Democrat, which doubted that he had committed the 9 murders, reported that Richards broke down during his final moments, but this was contradicted by other newspapers' accounts of his execution. Criminal psychology and profiling was not used as an investigative technique until the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888, 9 years after Richards' execution. In 2018, forensic psychologist Catherine Ramsland referred to Richards as the Old West's Ted Bundy. Both Richards and Bundy used their charisma to manipulate others, and both displayed a complete lack of remorse for their crimes. Ramsland also wrote that the differences between the two men, noting that Bundy murdered for sexual gratification, whereas Richards had no preferred method of killing or type of victim. Furthermore, Bundy fought his execution while Richard was indifferent to his death sentence. She further described a possible reason for his violent behaviour, citing a severe head injury that he received shortly before the killing started. Richards himself briefly mentioned this injury to the Sedalia Weekly Bazoo, claiming that he received the injury whilst travelling with several companions in the spring of 1877. When pressed about the circumstances that led to the injury, Richards refused to elaborate on the incident. Richards used various aliases during his travels. In one account of his life published in the Sedalia Weekly Bazoo, he admitted to having used the false names George Gallagher, F.A. Hodge, and William Hudson. He also admitted to corresponding with various acquaintances under the names D.J. Roberts, J. Littleton, and W.A. Littleton. At the time of his arrest and execution, it was a popular belief that all criminals were of poor quality and limited education. The horrific nature of his crimes gave him some notoriety, which increased after his capture due to in part of his not fitting with the public's preconception of criminals, with reporters and members of the public often struck by his charisma, good looks, his education, and outspokenness. He was featured in a handful of books and periodicals. The first of these was The Philosophy of Insanity, Richard the Nebraska Fiend, by Dr. John Sanderson Christensen, published on 9th February 1879. A Nebraska State Journal interview with Richards before his execution was published in a trail pamphlet titled Life and Confession of Stephen D. Richards, the murderer of 9 persons executed at Minden, Nebraska, April 26, 1879. The pamphlet, published on the 1st of May 1879, 5 days after his hanging, includes entries about other contemporary criminal cases as well. After his execution, interest in Richards dwindled and he subsequently faded from public memory. In modern times, Richards is now acknowledged as Nebraska's first documented serial killer. NET Nebraska's documentary, Until He Is Dead, A History of Nebraska's Death Penalty, featured Richards as a prime example of the public spectacle of the state's early executions. The documentary mistakenly mentioned him under his Samuel Richards alias. An episode of the Sci-Fi Channel documentary series Paranormal Witness titled The Nebraska Fiend, features a family who's purportedly being tormented by Richard's spirit, with an unnamed actor betraying him. He was featured in the 2021 novel The Scarlet Pen, written by Jennifer Ularic as part of the historical crime series True Colours. The novel is a fictionalised version of Richard's interaction with his fiancée, to whom he regularly sent letters.